Yana hawe yo hawe yana yo we no. 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 Yana hawe yo hawe yana we ne yo one.
It's useful to connect to something outside of myself, but like I actually needed to connect to myself. So there is chaos, there's so much grief, there's anger, all of these things that are very much living in my body all the time. And there's also a part of me that's okay. And that was new for me to be able to like know that that place existed. It was nice to find a part in myself that was just like, yep, I know everything that went down. I know how fucked it was. And also, you're okay.
This is episode 26 of Unbroken Chain. I'm Maura James, and that is Jennifer Patterson. Jennifer is a total badass, and she really truly defies categorization. But one of the things that runs through the current of so much of what she does, she calls grief work, and she uses plants and breath work to explore survivorhood and to embody healing in really radical ways, because so much of healing in the West and in America specifically happens, that's quote unquote healing, happens in institutions. And what Jennifer has made her life about, first to heal herself and now as an offering to the rest of us, is a devotion to spiritual practices that are somatic, that are rooted in the body, and for that reason make foundational, transformative shifts in healing that is accessible and allow people that are marginalized to take part in their own healing. And it's fucking radical. I don't know what else to say. Like, Jennifer's model is where we all need to be headed if we're going to get out of this thing, human brothers and sisters. And it's where we came from. It's so clear that these practices, these medicines have been working in tandem with humans for thousands of years for good reason. It to me just seems so clear that it's deeply symbiotic, and that the answers and the relationships and the relief that we need is available. And we can make it accessible to each other without asking permission from the institutions. So I just want to make one note here, because she and I talk about how our psychedelic journeys helped us so much shift our relationship to alcohol. And I've talked about this a little bit before, but I spent years of my 20s being that girl at the party, that girl at the bar, that girl at wherever the alcohol is going down. And there are probably, well, definitely still people out there in the world who only know me from that time and probably remember me as that girl. And part of being that girl was that I thought that I was stuck in that trap forever, that I didn't have a way out. And I made that shift because I ended up in the jungle drinking ayahuasca and no longer needing to use alcohol in the way that I had been before as a compensation for the places where I didn't like myself was just one of many beautiful gifts that came from that medicine. And that kind of shift changes your entire reality, changed my entire reality. And it's that kind of life-saving healing that is the reason that we're all here having this hang today, why I care so much and why Jennifer does too. I'm not sober now. I did not do a 12-step program. I took the plant medicine path. I know many people that have gone through the 12 steps and whose life has been saved by that. So this conversation is not about how the psychedelic path is the only path or the best, but what this conversation is about is that we should be sharing all of this information with one another and making all of the options available and safe and accessible. And as one other side note, Bill, who wrote the big book, who founded Alcoholics Anonymous, he loved LSD. It was a big part of his healing and his recovery from alcohol. And I encourage you, if you want to read more about that, to look it up, because although it did not end up in the 12-step process, he wrote a lot about it and was an advocate of it for a period of his life when it was possible to speak more openly about those kinds of things. You should find Jennifer online, corpusritual.com. She's done a lot of writing about healing, especially in queer spaces and especially from sexual violence. She is the editor of Queering Sexual Violence and the Hematopoiesis Press, both of which I encourage you to check out. She's so generous in sharing her personal experience here, and she had me over to her magical herb cave apartment in Brooklyn. The kitchen is just stacked from floor to ceiling with beautiful bottles of tinctures and salves. You have to check out her shop, corpusritual.com. And I just want to give a special shout out to the smoke blend. I've had 2 people now use that to stop smoking cigarettes. I'm just such a fucking fan. And I believe so much in the future that's possible if we all step up like she is. She really fucking cares, and she's making a difference. So I'll let her do the rest. Come hang out with us. Jennifer Patterson.
So trauma, I feel like, it's a lot of things. I think if you kind of look at the mainstream definition, you often see like war and car accidents or violent experiences, sexual violence. And I think also like those things are, yes, for sure, all trauma. And also there's a way that there is so much trauma just in the everyday of so many people's living experiences. So more and more people are beginning to acknowledge the impact of like racism and transphobia and homophobia and sexism and like all the ways that oppression shapes our daily experiences and like shapes our experiences in our bodies and responses to the way that the world can hold or can't hold us. And trauma is, I feel like a lot of people describe it as a break from the fabric of life or like a rip out of reality. And there's this one writer I love, Ariane Zuartez, who says something like it's a shear in the ordinary fabric. And I think that is true. It pulls us out of what we might believe about the world or know about the world. But then there's also, you know, I always think of people who it's not just a one-time rupture, it's an ongoing experience. So like, you know, survivors of childhood sexual abuse or any childhood trauma or, you know, like living with the legacy of white supremacy and racism and how those are the fabric. It's not a rip, it's like that's the fabric, if that makes sense.
And then how does the experience of trauma in the past affect the present moment that we're living in?
Well, yeah, trauma's not, we can read about trauma theory, we can like have an intellectual understanding of trauma, but the lived experience of trauma is somatic. It's in our bodies. It's like, it's in our energy. It's the way it's shift. And it's like the ways that our body holds those experiences that are either out of the ordinary or are shockingly and heartbreakingly common and everyday, or like the micro and macro aggressions of living in the world for so many people. And so there's a way that trauma is timeless. It's out of time. It's, for me at least, it's like it's like time traveling. It's like all of these times exist at once. And so the ways that our bodies hold on to these experiences continue until they're met either with like witness, compassion, another person willing to hold space with you, be with you through it, you know, changing our relationship to the ways that our bodies have held on to and continue to experience trauma.
Yeah, I'm struck as you're listing all those things. I'm like, I don't really see where those are offered in sort of mainstream Western culture. And I know that we treat a lot of symptoms of that, like stress and anxiety, but in terms of trying to really get to the root of this, how did you end up on this path?
Definitely from a personal place. I experienced abuse in my childhood, lots of kinds of abuse in my young adulthood. I was raped when I was 19, experienced a physical assault when I was 22, and then like later 20s. And I mean, really from like childhood and on, I was always like very depressed. That was just kind of like my resting state. As I got older and like left for college and started drinking became like a really good tool to kind of just like block out so much. And so I like developed all of these quote unquote mental health issues that like when I would go, I had therapists all through my 20s, early 30s on lots of medications, lots of antidepressants. But I like nothing was shifting for me. Like they might have kept me here in the world in some way, but like I wasn't living a life that felt alive. I was living a life that felt very flat. You know, and I think some of that had to do with drinking too. Like drinking was my like primary tool in my 20s for coping with the trauma I'd experienced. And it worked in some ways until it didn't, you know, like it was helpful to like help me disappear a bit and just like drop out of what I didn't want to feel. And of course it became a problem at a certain point. And, you know, it's something that I still navigate. I'm not sober, and I'm someone who has really changed my relationship to alcohol by doing intentional psychedelic work, which is a little outside of, you know, mainstream narratives around addiction and recovery. So yeah, it's an interesting space to be in because I've seen my own life shift, and it's also not exactly how people imagine these stories go.
Yeah, no, I can relate to that so much. That's so exciting to hear you talk about that, because I think I got to a point with drinking in my 20s too where I felt really out of control, and like I, you know, was blacking out and couldn't enter social situations and respond the way that I wanted to. But I don't think I knew when I started my psychedelic journey that would be a part of it, was healing that relationship. So I'm curious what the messages that you received are.
I mean, there were a few. So my first psychedelic experience was with Iboga about 5 years ago. Iboga's a plant that grows in South Africa or West Africa and a couple countries. And there's an alkaloid that grows in another plant that is in other areas of the world as well. If you look it up, it's predominantly spoken about for opioid and addiction around those kinds of substances. And you know, it's much broader than that too. It's got like a rich history and current use in communities, and it's got like a huge spiritual practice connected to it, and it's, you know, also being over harvested and struggling around sustainability and exploitation. And there's, you know, whenever I feel like talking about psychedelics, especially as a white person, it's always important for me to also place myself in a larger conversation because it's very much connected to a lot of indigenous practices that are still being practiced today. And so, you know, there's a lot of caution that comes along with like working with these medicines and talking about them. But yeah, my first experience with Iboga, I had decided to do Iboga not necessarily for drinking. It was more just like I was like in a new relationship and I was really struggling around self-worth and abandonment stuff and other things. I felt very out of control, and I felt like I needed something radical. Like I had been engaged in healing work in different ways. I'd been in therapy. You know, like I knew about trauma. I knew the ins and outs. I had trained as a rape crisis counselor at this point and was on call in an emergency room and like did community organizing around sexual violence. So like I knew the impact of it. I just couldn't really make larger shifts in my life. So I like learned about Iboga, which was a totally coming from like the 80s of DARE and like say no to drugs. You know, like I don't think I had ever picked up along the way that drugs and psychedelics and plant medicines are actually a healing tool too. Yeah. So I feel like I missed that memo. And then when I learned about it, I was like, what? Oh my God.
This exists?
Yeah. It's like, what? So that was cool to learn about. And it took me a while to come around to doing it. Because, you know, I struggled so much with alcohol that I just really didn't ever try anything else in my trying years. I think I had like smoked weed, but I was like, none of this is for me. And like, I'm too out of control, and I'm, I have an addictive personality. And it's like, I can't go near those things because it'll just be bad news. So I had to sit with it for a while. And then when I did, it felt like a good option. I read a lot about it. I spoke a lot with the person I learned about it from. And so when I did the first ceremony, it was with intention, and there was a certain framework for what I was hoping to get out of it. But as anyone who's worked with psychedelic knows, you get that maybe, and you get lots of other stuff too that you're not anticipating. But I think like the big thing that came out of that ceremony, which is a multi-day ceremony, so you're just in it for a few days. You're tripping for up to 17, 20 hours sometimes. Was like I finally got to see the impact of the violence I had experienced in my life. So I got to like see it visually in visions, and I also got to feel it in my body. So like one of the big things that I came out of it with was that I was able to feel what my body felt like as a child. So like I was like 7 or 8 years old. I felt like I could like see my child self, and I could feel like the fear, and I could feel how unstable it was. And it made sense. Like how I was now felt like it finally made sense. And I was like, oh, of course you feel like this. Like if that's what your body's felt like since you were 7 or 8 years old, like it all is okay. I got the gift of just like making sense to myself, and it was huge. It was
much forgiveness.
Yeah. And it also made me like value myself a lot more, where I was like, wait a minute. Like, and it did, things continued. I worked with that medicine twice more and have done a bunch of other work, but it was also my first psychedelic, so I just had no framework for it either. And it just like, I was shocked. So it kind of like literally blew my mind in the best way.
Did you have fear around it that you had to work through?
I didn't. My way of being in the world was already pretty extreme, and I think like I was, like the way people talk about Ibogas, it's like it's the most powerful psychedelic in the world,
right? And
I think that was enticing to me. Like, if I'm honest, like I'm a little, like at this point, and when I was younger, I used to be like, what is wrong with me? Like, why? I love skydiving. I've like done some, like I like extreme things. Like I was like, there must be something wrong with me. It's because of getting fucked up young, and like, yeah, so I kind of was excited about it.
I love those extremes too, because I feel like that's where I figure out who I am. It is in like responding to those challenges.
Yeah, totally.
I love that feeling.
Yeah. I mean, I had some fear, in the days before, but I also just had no clue what I was in for. So it was kind of like, I really didn't know. Something that's interesting on Iboga and all psychedelics, I feel like, is the stretch of time changes. And so you are tripping for a long time, but also you have no clue what time is anymore. So I just remember like what felt like lifetimes in the beginning was me trying to control something that like I knew was out of my control. And I like vacillated between being like, oh my God, I'm so fucked up that it took this like extreme thing that like I may have just fundamentally altered the course of my life to do. And like then I would flip back to being like, no, you love yourself so much that you're like willing to take a risk in the hopes of feeling better than you feel. Like there has to be a better. I needed to know that there was a better, or I like wouldn't have been able to stay around probably too much longer.
Wow.
So I think the fear started once I was already in it.
What did I do?
Late. Yeah.
Is there a purging process with Iboga?
There is, yeah. That's one thing that I've historically, like, I get car sick pretty much every time I'm in a car. I get nauseous very easy, and nausea is for some people, it's a really big part. So I don't think I've ever been more nauseous in my life. The physical experience of doing Iboga is very, very extreme. You're basically just laying in a bed or on a mat for that entire stretch of time, and you might go to the bathroom to pee, like someone would have to help you. You're not moving, really. Most people. I wasn't. I was writing during it, though. That was one thing I do, but...
So you could have eyes open and engage with...
Kind of, yeah. I mean, it's very hard to read my writing from it, but yeah, there was a way I was able to do some of it. Yeah.
And what about the shamanic container? Because that feels like one of those experiences that you definitely should do with a guide.
Yeah, it's definitely something to do with a guide. It's something to do ideally with someone who has a lot of traditional training and background and is connected to the larger community of the substance you're working with. And I worked with 2 facilitators who spent a month in Gabon and were initiated, and so there was definitely a lot of support. It's a little bit harder to find in the U.S. because it's not currently legal like so many things, and so a lot of people go to clinics in other countries to do it. There's a lot in South America and Mexico. As with everything, there's exploitation and risk, and a lot of people traveling down from the U.S. and setting up shop and maybe not having too much integrity or ethics in their work.
Yeah, I'm glad you were mentioning that at the beginning, as to preface this kind of, like, how do we reconcile that these medicines are coming into the West, and they're coming to help, I think, and they want to be part of that, but we have to honor the lineage that they're part of. Like, how do we navigate that as white people?
Yeah, I think it's like an evolving conversation. It's a conversation that I look to communities of color to lead, and like grounding it in those communities and that work. And I think, in the world where everything is monetized and there's a lot of capitalizing on these practices, it's murky. Iboga ceremonies, not in Gabon with communities, I'm not sure how much they cost there, but in like a clinic setting in Mexico, say, run from like $5,000 to $20,000. And
what?
Yeah. And when you think about too, like the large, I wouldn't say majority, I have no idea, but a large percentage of it is people who are struggling with opiate use, which, crosses the race, gender, class spectrum. It's being touted as like the cure-all, which it's not a cure, it's not a magic bullet, it's definitely a catalyst, and it's a tool. But what does it mean if these tools and these like life-changing experiences are completely and utterly out of reach for people, which, is a larger conversation in healing work, I think, in general, and the like kind of like rise of what I and some other people have called the healing industrial complex of just like...
Ooh, tell me about that.
Well, it comes from... I feel like disability activist and writer Mia Mingus talks about the medical industrial complex, and I can't remember where that healing industrial complex came from, but it's something that I've found in my own way and just from being in these worlds. There's a real monetization of healing, especially on Instagram or like on people's websites. It's like I'm forever being told that like I could have a life-changing experience, but it's going to cost me $250 for an hour. And so to me, like that's something that I really try to move against in a lot of ways, because I've never been able to afford those healing sessions. The majority of like all the healing work I've done, both with therapists and in like holistic healing spaces, has been with sliding scale practitioners. It's been with people that like can see that I'm struggling and I'm like struggling to access care, and like we find a way to make it work. We do a trade, somehow there's like an interdependence that can happen in these spaces. And so I get people needing to survive and make money, and New York City is a hard place to be a practitioner because rents are wildly high, and there's insurance, and there's, there isn't the safety net of like having a paid vacation or like paid sick days, and we are the only people that can do our own work. So it's wildly complex and also very scary to me that so much healing work, life-changing healing work, is out of reach to people for so many, and not just financially, like so many other reasons too.
Well, you've made that such a big part of your mission. I mean, you were just writing today, I saw about how you do a sliding scale, and it's really important to make your healing work available.
Yeah, I mean, that's something that it's changed over the years. I mean, I've been working as an herbalist for 7-ish, maybe 8 years almost. I'm in my 3rd year of working with breathwork, and it's evolving. I mean, I knew that I wanted to do a more accessible platform for my work, financially accessible in other ways too. But you know that the definition of that is changing sometimes as I'm like, oh shit, I do have to rent a space, and like, oh God, like, yeah, I had to cancel my appointments because I got sick and I can't do healing work when I'm sick. And, you know, so there's like, I'm like learning along the way, but it is really important to me. And I think like, knock on wood, I intend to offer some of my work always on a sliding scale, and also like multiple access points too. So like can't afford a one-on-one session still totally makes sense. There's a group session we can do, or like maybe we can even figure out a trade sometimes depending on my capacity. And yeah.
Thank you. That's amazing.
I mean, there's so many people. That's what I get so upset in certain spaces that I've been in where it's like there is a real narrative around value. You know, if you value your work and if you value your role in the world and the fabric of life, then you charge a lot of money. And if you don't, you don't. That's like a collective narrative that a lot of people really believe. And people like accessing healing too, you know, like adding more value to something because it's more expensive. And it's like, it's not necessarily more valuable. It's hard. And it's like sliding scale's been around forever. Like barter and trade and, you know, like gift economies, like all of these things exist. I was reading this amazing book. Oh my God, I have a hard time remembering names of things. It was amazing. And there was this one piece in it by this writer talking about, it was an acupuncturist, and she was talking about the legacy of the Black Panthers creating free and like sliding scale work and doing acupuncture because their community needed it. And it's revolutionary. To be able to like create access for other people, knowing that it's needed is like, it's a paradigm shifter. It like lets you believe that other worlds are possible because they're already happening. You know, like sliding scale's already happening. It's been happening. Like I know so many sliding scale practitioners. So yeah, it's helpful to remember when I get totally overwhelmed by the exploitation.
Yeah. It's just such a radical act of love. It's really beautiful.
Thanks.
So breathwork is a big part of your offering, and that's a tool for trauma specifically?
It's a tool for a lot of things. I think people who have experienced trauma, lots of different kinds of trauma, experience some relief in it. Like anything, it's individual still. Like some people find it very healing and very supportive. Some people find it to be like not the right thing for the moment, and maybe they'll come back a couple months later, a year later. The particular breathwork style that I practice, I studied with Aaron Telford, and it's a lineage from David Elliott, who is out in California. And it's an active meditation, so it's faster paced than like day-to-day breathing. It's a 2-part inhale, 1-part exhale, and so you're breathing through an open mouth, and it's like very circular and quick. I always say breathwork is like a big umbrella. There's like holotropic breath work, there's rebirthing, there's pranayamic, there's other kinds of yogic breath, and then this breath work is literally just called breath work, but it's also its own particular style. All of these styles of breathing are supportive in their own ways. It's like altered state work. It's similar to psychedelics in a way. You're tapping into other realms that are also like in your body, in your experience. The first time I did it was years ago with Aaron Telford in Brooklyn, and I was in like a really low spot, and I was like really struggling and just kind of like had lost my connection to life yet again. And I did it, and again, no understanding really of what I was getting into, which is often people's first time. They're like, I don't know what's gonna happen. And I'm like, a lot's gonna happen. So I finally was like doing it, and I was like, oh, I like actually feel okay. So there is chaos, there's so much grief, there's anger, all of these things that are very much living in my body all the time. And there's also a part of me that's okay. And that was new for me to be able to like know that that place existed.
Is that the witnessing place that's seeing it all happen?
I think, yeah. I used to get really resentful in like, I don't even know where this really came from, but when I was doing like a lot of organizing work around sexual violence and trauma and like rape crisis counseling, there's this narrative that some people like to say is like, oh, there's still a part of you that's innocent, or there's like always a part of you that's untouched by the trauma. And I still am not on board with that idea. I still am just like, but what if there isn't? For some people, that might not be true. And then we're going to have pressure to find it. Oh, well, if I don't feel that, there must be something wrong with me. And like the trauma was so bad that now I'm forever gone. It puts the onus on the survivor and the person living with it. And that said, it was nice to find a part in myself that was just like, yep, I know everything that went down. I know how fucked it was. And also, you're okay right now for this moment, this second. And it's like, it could be a tiny little spot. It could be for a second in time. But yeah, it felt like a huge relief for me.
Do you feel like psychedelics and breathwork then help us like sort of grow that space inside of us and bring it back into the sort of quote unquote sober life?
Totally. Yeah. Yeah. I think that's a big part of it. And like a lot of times in like one-on-one sessions or groups, you know, like sometimes it's just posing the question of is there a place in you that is okay? And like sometimes people are like, fuck no, there isn't. And I'm like, cool. Is there a part of you that can believe that there might be a place someday that is okay? And then usually people are like, yeah, okay, all right, fine, I could, yeah. So it's like finding an in somehow and then, yeah, like growing that a little bit, letting it get bigger in different ways. And I think, you know, it's not just with psychedelics and breathwork. I think once you know that that place is there, it becomes a bit easier to remember in the day-to-day. I mean, there's still plenty of times, though, that I forget and that I'm just like, fuck it, there's not, you know. And that's okay, too. Sometimes there's not, you know, like... We live in a pretty terrifying, burning world. And so I think also these practices are like trying to find a balance between hope and despair, which I bounce between all the time.
Yeah. Yeah. How do we do this work that requires us to be quiet and make time for ourselves when we also have to be these humans operating in a social construct and capitalism?
Yeah.
All the time. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. I don't always know
how
we do.
Yeah.
Yeah.
What for you is the body emotion, body spirit connection? Because it feels to me like one of the reasons why psychedelics have been such a huge part of my life is just because I experience them in such a direct way that I carry that in my body in a way that like talk therapy could never sort of switch over for me. So I'm wondering what you've observed.
Yeah, I mean, that's been my relationship with talk therapy too, or just like more traditional talk therapy. I had a lot of therapists in my 20s that would point blank tell me that they like didn't quite know how to work with like, there was a way where like trauma wasn't quite understood as being not just a like body thing. It's not just an intellectual thing. It's not just that I can't forget something or like I just keep replaying the narrative. It is multifaceted. All of the bodies are in relationship to each other in trauma. And talk therapy is amazing, and it definitely was supportive to me at different points. It also, at a certain point, was limiting for me. And I think a lot of people, it's like, I'm a writer. I can write my story all day long. I could tell it to you over and over. And there is a way, too, where like I was hitting a point. I didn't share my story for a number of years. And then in my like mid-20s, maybe, I started sharing it more, and it became just a thing that I was doing. I was like, here is my story. Here it all is, all of the trauma. I remember every time I would start dating someone, too, it was like a couple months in, I'd be like, or maybe not even, let's get honest, it was like a couple days in, I would be like, would you like to hear this terrible story? And, you know, I do that still. I think in some ways it's like we're trying to connect with people and let people know what we're carrying and sharing the stories. But there was like an autopilot to it that would come in sometimes where it would just be like, this is how I tell this story. And that, yeah, after a while it wasn't helpful to me anymore. And I still tell my story, and I'm still very connected to writing and speaking, and they're all useful too, but we need other ways of moving through trauma that are more embodied. You know, often with psychedelics and breathwork, it's like we lose access to language. Like language, at least for me, and like a lot of people that I've worked with in breathwork, it's like people come out of the sessions and I'm like, how are you feeling or whatever? And people often are just like, don't have couldn't tell you. Like, so much happened that I, like, literally can't even tell you. And I think that there's something really amazing in that, because we get to go beyond language. Like, language is not the final thing, even though I love language. You know, like, it's another way of being in something. And I think it builds trust too. It's like you can, in breathwork, or I guess in psychedelics too, it's like you can feel, and like any plant medicine work, working with herbs, people that haven't worked with tinctures before or something will work with a tincture, and sometimes they'll be like, nothing's, like, I can't feel anything, nothing's happening. But then, like, a couple months later, they'll be like, oh, like, things feel different. Or, like, sometimes, like, I had a client who, like, a year later was like, yes, I've been taking this every single day and my life feels fundamentally different. It, like, forces us to both have patience and trust in, like, the things that we can't see or, like, give quick language to.
Yes, such an act of faith.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes, which that, I think all of these things too, it's like for those of us who have lost faith in the world, in a God, these are ways that we can, like, gain some faith back, and they're body-based. It's in ourselves. Like, we get to connect to our own spirit and, like, spirit at large too.
Yeah, do you feel connected either through these experiences or through something you've studied? Do you feel connected to a particular form of God or greater source?
I think I do. I was raised Catholic, and I think, like, I struggled connecting to Catholicism for all of the reasons. I mean, we could talk all day about that. A lot of us know it's kind of a rough place. But yeah, like, I think I, like, lost faith in a lot of things for a long time. I, like, lost faith in myself. I lost faith in people. I lost trust. I mean, trust is still a huge thing that I'm, like, constantly working with. And so I think my relationship to it is different than how I was raised, and is bigger in some ways. It's not connected to, like, one direction or, like, one way of understanding. I connect to spirit all the time. And I don't know what spirit is. And, like, I don't even need to know. And spirit's also me. It's my own spirit. And I think, too, you know, like, in so many ways, for me, it's both useful to connect to something outside of myself, but, like, I actually needed to connect to myself, too. Like, that felt way more important. And so, yeah, a lot of it's, like, connecting to myself.
That was a huge shift for me, was just realizing that I didn't have to keep looking for the thing outside. Yeah. That was actually, I kept missing the whole point by continuing to externalize it. It was like,
totally.
You're cutting yourself off by doing that.
Totally.
Yeah.
And it's not a comparison, I guess. Everybody's got their way of thriving and surviving in this world. So they're all valid, but I think for me I needed a little something different.
Yeah. No, I can respect that. Yeah. Do you feel like these practices, breathwork, psychedelics, are they most helpful or rewarding when they're consistent practices? Do you have to keep returning to these places?
I think it's a both and. I think some people go into, say, like a psychedelic ceremony and feel like once was enough and they got a lot of what they needed, or maybe they can carry it into their life in a way that feels, you know, rich and continuing. I think some people feel like it needs to be a practice, so it needs to be more regular. I know with clients, I have a wide range. Some people come once and never come again, but found it very impactful. Some people didn't necessarily enjoy it. Some people come once a month. Some people come a couple times every year. You know, it's all over. And I know for me, it's better as a regular practice. And it's something that, you know, in the hustle of the world and being I don't know what I would call myself. I think the word is solopreneurs.
Oh, yeah.
I don't know. You know, being a one person show is like, sometimes it's hard to connect to the practices that I really need. And then I'm like, oh shit, I need to go to breathwork.
Yeah.
So,
yeah.
But I try to do breathwork once a month at least. Sometimes I go through phases where I'm doing it much more frequently or more during the week or just like short bits of it. Psychedelic work, I'm constantly reminded that I need to do it like almost like quarterly. I'm like, yes. I need to do my like quarterly psychedelic ceremony at least. And you know, it doesn't have to be doesn't have to be Iboga every time. It can be many other things, but that was a gift to learn of the world of psychedelic work, because I imagine maybe I would have found a way through some of the things, but it was a catalyst for me and super amazing.
Yeah, I guess to kind of close the circle, like afterwards coming back to substances, was the attraction no longer there, or were you aware of how your relationship with alcohol was hurting you?
Both, yeah. I mean, I've had some ceremonies in different kinds of work where I'm like, ooh, alcohol is like dark magic. It's like, and I like dark magic. I'm on board with it. I think we need shadow work, underground work, poison medicine work. And also, it just felt, there was like a heaviness to it. Like, I think that with alcohol, I was definitely trying to, I think, lose myself, but somehow find myself too for a while, or just like find something else. And with psychedelic work, it feels like a real desire to find myself and like be with myself. So that they do feel at odds in that way. And yeah, I think I worked with Iboga. I did flood ceremonies 3 times over the course of, I guess, 2.5 years maybe. And by the 3rd one, I came out of it and I didn't drink for a couple months. I just didn't want to. It wasn't necessarily like a purity thing. I wasn't trying to like it was more just like I didn't feel drawn to it. When I was younger, it was like there were multiple moments where like I got a DUI and the expectation afterwards was that I stopped drinking, and like I had to go to these classes, and like, you know, I was just going to be like, and I was like, I did not stop drinking, you know, like I didn't want to. I resented somebody telling me I had to. You know, I've had ultimatums from a partner in the past asking me to stop drinking, and you know, I would do it for a period of time, but it always came with anger and resentment and like, oh, it's not really a problem, so why do I have to do this? And now it's kind of like, oh, it was a problem for sure, and I have to be very aware of like why I'm desiring a drink. It's much more conscious. And I think right after Iboga too, like at different points when I would have a drink, I could feel it in seconds. Like it, you know what I mean? Whereas like when I was younger, I would be like, oh, I need like 10 whiskey on the rocks. But like, I do not need 10 whiskey on the rocks, you know? Like, do not. Yeah. I do not. Yeah. Nobody does.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's been a practice of really kind of interrogating the why. Like I went through a pretty terrible breakup almost 2 years ago. And that was the first time, I should say too, when I did Iboga the first time, I had to come off of all antidepressants and anti-anxiety pills. A lot of them are contraindicated, which I didn't know. And so I kind of went into it being like, well, I'll come off of them and I'll go back on them if I need to. And I had been told that some people didn't or didn't feel the desire to, and I haven't. And that was 5 years ago. And again, the caveat that like they are tools for many people and they're life-saving and life-sustaining. For me, they had reached their limit for sure. But it was interesting to be going through such a really hard time without any medication. And I stopped drinking during it because I was just like, I do not, like, alcohol's a depressant. I do not need any more help feeling depressed, you know? Like, why do I feel depressed? Because I was drinking alcohol in my 20s alongside all the other shit. Yeah. So it's way more conscious. And then there are periods of time where I don't drink at all, and it like is nice, and I'm just like, oh, this is like a thing I'm doing for myself, and it feels good, and I feel clear. And when I do drink now, it's like I have a drink, 2 drinks, and then I like call it a day. And if I don't, the next day I'm like, what? You're not doing very well. Let's think about this.
Totally. Yeah.
You know, like what's going on for you? Yeah. Maybe you need to go do some more work.
Yeah, I love what you said about how psychedelics helped you be with yourself, because I came back from psychedelics and realized how much alcohol had been about helping me feel comfortable in social situations, mostly because I didn't like who I was, and I didn't know how to be with people as the trash person that I felt like I was.
Totally.
And I realized that the control that I felt with alcohol was an illusion. And in fact, the surrender that's required in psychedelics was the actual strength. And that was like a huge mindfuck, a huge shift.
For sure.
Really beautiful. Yeah.
Yeah. Because it's like, I felt like that too. I'm an introvert. I like being in my little herb cave.
Yeah.
And like, I also like people a lot now. It's night and day. Like, there's pictures of me right before and after my first ceremony. I was like crunched over, that you could see it on me all the time. And afterwards, I was not. And I feel like that. I feel like I stand a little bit taller. I feel like, I still get nervous and freaked out. And it's like hard for me to share my voice still and all the things. But like, it's different. I can go into a space and be like, well, if they're not on board, they're not on board. I'm going to go home to my herb cave. It'll be fine, Like, it's different.
Yeah.
So I totally relate to that.
I think I made space to be uncomfortable too. Like,
Yeah.
it stopped being the end of the world to find myself
Yeah.
uncomfortable. Because in psychedelics, like, you're uncomfortable for, like you were saying, time disappears. You might be uncomfortable for an infinite...
For the rest of your life, it feels like.
Yeah. Yeah.
And also, like, to be human is to be, like, we're all uncomfortable at different points in social spaces. Even the, like, biggest, grandiose kind of, like, oh, I'm very outgoing. It's like, that's also a form of coping. To
Like
be
performance,
in, like,
almost.
sometimes. I think some people are, like, they're comfortable being in a space, but there still is insecurity. There still is fear. There's still, like, worry that you're not going to be liked. All of us. I try to go into a space and be like, I bet 50% of the room right now is freaked out to be here. Yeah. And like, so am I. So it's okay,
And then that becomes an offering that you can share to people in your transparency about it.
Yeah.
Yeah, totally. You had mentioned harm reduction, and I want to ask you about that, because sometimes going into psychedelic spaces, especially when there is a lot of trauma that hasn't been processed in other ways, I feel like can lead to a quote-unquote bad trip. And so I've sort of come in this lineage of psychedelic work where it's like, there are no bad trips. There can be really challenging experiences. And also the container that you're held in makes a huge difference.
Yeah.
I wonder if you have any perspective about the best way to approach that work safely.
Yeah, I mean, I think that feels like a hard thing, because I feel like because of legality issues in the U.S., it's like a lot of information is underground and it's hard to access. And so, when you're working with any practitioner, it's doing your research, asking around, like checking with people, reading reviews, or like reading about some of their work, or like listening to them speak, seeing if you connect with them. And I think with psychedelic work, it's a little bit harder because people are not as easily accessible, because they're not as easily visible. So I agree. Like, I think that there are no bad trips in the right setting. So like, if you're, like if you take something and go out to a party where nobody, and like some serious trauma shows up and nobody can hold you, like that could go bad or like it could go not good very quickly. There's probably still a lot of information in there but like, again, would need to be processed with someone who is capable and able to hold that and hold you in it after. Yeah, I think that's what does feel scary about this kind of work. I mean, there's lots of things that are risky, but just because people are in like practices of healing doesn't mean that they're not also harming people. Like, there is a lot of harm in the psychedelic world. There's a lot of exploitation and sexual violence and abuse, and it means we really have to do our research and really don't just jump on something because it's the only thing you found. I have people that reach out to me through email often about practitioners, and it's hard because I don't really know how to communicate what I would like to communicate to people.
Right.
And so that feels like a sad thing. That feels very sad to me, because it's like, I know the potential of this work, and it's like I just can't. I don't know how to get
Protect
the information
yourself while sharing. Yeah.
It makes sense to be cautious in it, for sure, because there's more and more of it happening all the time, and there's a lot of people that, I think that the ethics and integrity of the practitioner too are huge. It's like, if you're working with somebody who charges a shit ton of money and has no relationship to like indigenous communities that these medicines, not always, but often come from, or like, has kind of like ripped the practice out of its spiritual and religious and cultural traditions. It's tainted, like that medicine is tainted. And I think it's tainted with like greed and white supremacy and, you know, a lot of the structures that already exist that we're trying to break away from, but like we're all still in it, you know, like we can't. I both love the idea of dreaming of a new world, but like we're all coming from this broken world that we're in already. So how do we do that?
How do we do that?
Somebody tell us, help.
Yeah, that's a really good point, because I think it's really easy to set aside spiritual work or medicine work as like kind of preserved in some kind of way, but it's like we're all humans engaging in that arena. Yeah, that's a really good point. What do you think our ideal Medicinescape would look like? How would we be engaging with each other in a perfect world? It's a really big question to answer, but
I mean, access is a huge issue still. I think, you know, we see so many medicines being pushed into the medical model, which will be inaccessible still to lots of people. It might be accessible to some people, but it might be very inaccessible to lots of people still. And there's a way where, like, you know, I'm kind of on the outside of looking in on the psychedelic world, and I see like a lot of the same conditions being reconstructed in it. Power and privilege, and again, like white supremacy, and so many panels of all white people, and so many panels of only doctors, and really thinking about who has access to these medicines and why, and like who is losing access to these medicines and why, and like what's actually happening to the ecosystem that some of these plants come from, and what's happening to the communities, and what's happening to the practitioners that already exist in those communities doing this work. And so I guess I don't have an answer. I think it's more, there's a way where we still need to be in the question, I think, you know, like be very conscious of who is in spaces and who is not, who might feel like they never can access a space, which I think is something to consider across all healing platforms, you know, like when like so many healing spaces in New York City are like very white, and like a lot of people of color that are coming into these spaces, or like transgender and gender nonconforming people and queer people coming into these spaces of like predominantly white cisgender women. Not that they shouldn't have access to these spaces, obviously, but like how can we make them not just a space where people feel tokenized in, but like actually like an integral part of these communities that welcomes them in all of the ways, you know, like it involves the way our language is in the spaces, and like how we present ourselves, and you know, there's a lot to consider. And so I think, like, to me, access feels like a really big thing. Like, until we're able to start creating spaces that feel not promising safety, because we can't, I don't promise safety ever in spaces I lead.
what do you mean by that?
Well, I think that there's like a real prevalence of like, I've noticed in spaces, as a participant, I'll go into spaces that are healing spaces, and so often, you know, some of the language that's used is like, well, we're in a safe space now, or you're safe here. And like, I buckle immediately, because I'm like, I'm used to being told I'm safe when I'm not. And so I'm like, don't tell me that I'm safe here. Like, that's something that should be determined by me. And so I think in spaces that I'm facilitating, I promise to be holding a container as safe as I can, coming from my like white cisgender lens. But yeah, I think each person gets to decide what safe feels like in these spaces. And like sometimes walking into a room of most times I've heard from people that have come to my spaces or other talk about going to healing centers in the city, walking into a room of like predominantly white women when you're not a white woman immediately drops the level of safety for somebody. And I think like that's a hard truth for some practitioners to hear, because they want to be able to offer a space that's safe for everyone, but like it takes a lot of work to do that. And it doesn't mean that everyone's going to feel safe all the time too. And
in that case, I guess the best thing would be to ask and listen.
Yeah. Being open to critique and open to people's actual experiences, you know, like And, you know, like, as a queer person, I've been in spaces that do not feel comfortable to me, and do not, like, I would love to invite people I love and care about to come, and I know that it wouldn't feel comfortable to them. And it's hard because it's like, when they're being presented as, like, safe and healing for all, and they're not, we learn once again that something's not for us.
It's like another betrayal.
Yeah, it's another betrayal, for sure. And I think, like, people who have historically experienced, like, violence and exclusion from communities and spaces, I've heard from so many people who carry many different identities that they're like, no, I'm just not even going to try that space. There's stuff shifting, you know, as always. There's a lot shifting in, like, quote-unquote wellness worlds, and there's been more conversation, and involves, like, stepping back and giving up leadership roles and centering people who are experiencing exclusion and marginalization.
I know you put out a book called Queering Sexual Violence, sort of specifically trying to do that in that arena.
Yeah.
What were you responding to there? Or what are you working on?
The anthology is called Queering Sexual Violence, Radical Voices from Within the Anti-Violence Movement, and I started that probably almost a decade ago.
Wow.
I know. It's time again. Maybe 9 years ago. Yeah. And I was doing anti-violence work. I was part of a community project, an organizing project, and I was doing this rape crisis counseling work. And like, I've had a sensitivity since I was a child that I can enter a space and, like, immediately I feel who's not there. And so I think I brought that into the work I was doing, and I would see the ways that certain communities of people were not prioritized, or were, like, micromanaged in the work that I was involved in, or just not valued for the contributions that were already taking place, that had been already taking place for decades, and particularly around, like, queer and transgender people, LGBTQ people in these spaces. And, like, we are a huge percentage of the population of survivors. You know, like, the book kind of widens the net of, like, what we consider sexual violence. So, you know, like, people can comprehend, maybe not all, but many people can comprehend, like, rape, but they're not as able to comprehend, like, a trans woman experiencing daily street harassment as sexual violence, which it is. And so the book it's an anthology, and so it includes a lot of, like, 35 plus narratives around both survivorhood and also, like, multifaceted identities. So, like, it's not just queer focused, it's considering, like, all of the ways that people's identities shape their relationship to violence and their relationship to healing, and, like, what is available and accessible. And so a lot of people too, like, work in anti-violence, or, like, work in shelters, or do organizing work, and are, like, linking to, like, racial justice and economic justice and disability justice within anti-violence work. So yeah.
It's like, in order for there to even be justice, there's this reshaping or education that has to happen first about what we're even working on.
Yeah, and, like, who's not included when we're talking about certain things, you know? Like, again, like, monolithic narratives that are being touted as, like, the only narrative that excludes so many people. And, like, if people can't even see themselves in the narratives that are out there, like, how... You know, there's, like, this demand for, like, survivors to come forward, and it's like, why would a survivor come forward if nothing out there reflects their experience?
Right.
Like, what would be the motivation to feel, like, safe enough to do that, you know?
What was your process with transparency?
When I was raped at 19, I feel like I didn't... I mean, I had, like, a lot of dissociation and, like, really disconnected from it. I think I spent the first few months afterwards, I was, like, suicidal and very depressed and, like, couldn't go to classes. And I did not tell my mom for a few years, because I was also, I mean, I was raised Catholic and I was a virgin. And, like, you know, like, I was just like, she, of course, told me she would not have been upset. But, like, I still was this, like, oh, God, you know, like, spoiled milk. Which is terrifying, really, to think about. But I did share with some of my friends. I don't think I used the word rape right away. I think it was more of a, like, hey, this thing happened and, like, wasn't okay kind of stuff. And I think that changed over time. And then I experienced a physical assault when I was 22. And that I was like, I fucking knew what it was right away. And like, I told a lot of people about it. And I like went pretty public with it, experienced the consequence of speaking.
Really?
I did like kind of like my entry into doing anti-violence work was I was doing fundraising for an organization in Florida that was an anti-violence organization, and they would do yearly skydiving. So like you would raise money for this organization and then you would get to go skydiving, and I was like, sign me up. So I did that for like 5 years, I think. And I think the second or third year I got bold and like listed his name in my donation ask, and I think I like also I was very bold. I also posted it in like a high school Facebook alumni group, and I was like, just in case anyone is, because we went to high school together, but he raped me when we were both in college. So he found out, of course, and his lawyers contacted the organization, and I had to take his name out or I couldn't continue fundraising. And that was a really rough moment.
Yeah.
Where it's like, if we don't go through the justice system, which is an injustice system, which I don't believe in prisons, and I don't believe in that system as a place of getting much of anything. But if we don't go through those systems and we don't have something on paper saying it actually happened and that like legally it happened, it can be slander. So that made me irate. Yeah, I've been pretty vocal about it just because I didn't feel able to. It was impacting me so much that I like needed to talk about it. But I think it took me a while to like make connections back to the harm I had experienced as a child and like how it just continued for a long time.
Do you have, it sounds like you're an abolitionist.
Yeah.
Do you have a picture of what justice would look like in a situation like that? Like, especially if the other party, the offending party, is like not willing to be accountable. Like, does justice exist?
Yeah, that's something that, it's funny, it's come up a lot in my breathwork this week with people too. We've been talking about what accountability looks like if the other person cannot or will not be accountable. And so again, it's one of those things where I'm like, there are so many people doing amazing transformative and restorative justice work out there who have like really brilliant visions of things. Some people that come to mind are Aisha Shahida Simmons, Leah Lakshmi Pipesnia Samarasina, and Ejaris Dixon have a book coming out from AK Press, and Aisha does too actually in the fall, working with transformative justice and restorative justice. And so those are things for people to read about if they want to, because they've been doing that work for decades.
She'll be on the podcast.
Little plug, Aisha. But I think then for me, where I've come with it recently, just personally also needing accountability in different ways, it's like if I can't get other people to be accountable or there's an unwillingness to be accountable, then I need to be accountable to myself. So that means taking responsibility for the places in my life where I've caused harm. That means if like something is not good for me and is harming me, learning to walk away from that thing or that person, which is a lesson I've learned that lesson better than I've ever learned it in the last couple years, and it's a very hard lesson that I struggle with. But I think, like, what does it look like to be accountable to ourselves if we cannot get it from outside of ourselves? So
Boundaries.
Boundaries. Another non-answer to your
No, it's
question.
such an answer. Yeah. Well, I want to give a little moment for the work that you do with plants, because that seems like a big part of your practice with non-psychoactive plants.
Yeah.
I just curious how you see those plants as being part of the healing trauma picture. Do all plants have something to offer?
For sure. Yeah, I think so. I found plants. I grew up with plants. Like, my mom was a gardener. My grandma had these gorgeous gardens when I was growing up. They were less herbalist. They identified as gardeners. And they had, like, my mom had a beautiful, huge herb garden, though, that I remember just, like, being in. And so I, like, grew up being allowed to plant my own garden from a really young age, too, which was a huge gift. And then I, like, kind of, again, it was like, I don't know how these things like drop in and out of our individual consciousness, but I like didn't know about herbs for a while. They weren't a tool that I was reaching for in like my early 20s when I was like really struggling. I was being told medication's the solution. But yeah, I didn't have health insurance, and I had kidney stones, and so I like couldn't go to the hospital and didn't want to. And so I had them for a month. And I didn't have painkillers, I didn't have insurance, and I had like one painkiller from a friend that she'd given me. But I like started like researching. I like, there's got to be another way. Like, I have to find a way to like fucking navigate this. And herbs came up. So I was like, oh, herbs. Yes. I remember herbs from when I was 5 years old, and I forgot about them. So yeah, I just started doing a ton of research, and like I kind of dove in. I started making tinctures. I studied with some people. And I think I was really intimidated in the beginning because herbs and herbalism it's huge. It's a life, like I think breathwork too, and like psychedelics. It's like these are lifelong practices. I don't imagine that I'll be an expert ever. I hope I'm never an expert. I hope I'm always learning. But I like found allies that were supportive. And so I just like explored those relationships. I like found them in the world. I worked with them in salves and teas and tinctures, and they ended up becoming a really strong source of like support and like companionship. Plants are clearly the like superior species. I just love imagining plants being like, these humans think that they're in charge, but they just have no clue what's going on. So like that's kind of the energy I try to bring to my plant work, is like, these friends are in charge here. I'm not trying to get in the middle of it. Here's a way I've prepared something for you, but like they're doing the work. They're offering the support and care.
I really feel that in the way you present it. It's like you guys have this relationship. Like, here you go. I'll introduce you guys, but you guys have the relationship.
You can figure it out.
Yeah. You mentioned poison plants earlier. Is there a special way to approach those?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, they're poisonous. There's, a lot of different plants are poisonous. They also have a lot to teach us, like all plants. I hear stories about how poison ivy energetically is like a guardian of the forest. Like, it grows on the edges. It's like kind of keeping some of the bullshit out, ideally, because people are like, ooh, poison ivy, not going to go near it,
right.
So I love thinking about poison plants as like guardians of the darkness, the woods, the underworld. They're like the tenders of these places. And so they're also the tenders of those places in us too that exist. And so poison plants are really beautiful for doing shadow work, like integration of the shadow, integration of like harmful experiences, really like highlighting the ways that we all engage in harmful behaviors, both to people and the earth all the time. Of course, there's a spectrum of harm. There's some that are egregious, and there are things that are just so ordinary we forget that they're harmful. Engaging with each other, it's like we're constantly navigating like harm and love, I think, with each other. So they're like good supports in that work. And again, it's a spectrum of how to work with them. Like topically is a good way. So like I make a datura salve, and I've also been in these relationships with these plants with my friend Britta Love, who's done a lot of work around poison medicine too. She was kind of like my entry point. We've like made a lot of beautiful things together, like salves, and it's good topically and in small doses still, because there's still contraindications. And flower essences are a really good way to work with poison plants, or like plant essences, because you're basically putting the blossom or the leaf or part of the plant either in the water, or sometimes if it's like a rare plant, you take 2 mason jars and you have one full of water, and you just pour the water over the plant into the other mason jar over and over until gathering the essence. And so you're working with the energetics of the plant versus like the actual plant or the constituents of the plant. So those are ways that are a little bit less risky, but also like all of these plants most of them are still worked with by people too, in like indigenous communities and other communities around, a lot of them are psychoactive, they're also being used in that way. And again, it's like working with people who have an established and ongoing and like long-term relationship that's mutually respectful. there's lots of ways to work with them. But a good way to start is topically or just energetically or just admiring them, pictures,
Yeah.
talking to
like
them.
That. I guess kind of last questions. If there's someone who is just starting their relationship with plants, where would you point them to start? Is there a particular plant that would be a kind entry point?
I think depending on where people are located, it's like if you're in a city, just going into an herb shop and seeing where you're drawn, reading the names, maybe talking to the person. Because I think that there are so many plants, and there's so many plants that people are like, this is for anxiety, even though
Right.
the idea is to treat a holistic experience of a person rather than just like the manifestations or symptoms of things. Part of what's beautiful about working with plants is developing intuition. So you get to have a nonverbal or verbal relationship with something. So going into a shop and seeing where you're drawn can be really nice. And then maybe even getting an ounce or two and making tea with it. And maybe you don't even read about it for a while. Maybe you just gather your own information around it or see how your body feels or how you feel emotionally and then reading about it. Or if you're in a beautiful place and not the city. There's plants in the city too. I shouldn't say that. There's lots of amazing plants in the city, but if you have a certain plant in mind, depending on where you're located, it might be a little harder to find out in the world. But again, just going out on hikes and walks and meeting the plants where they live, I think is really nice. And there's a lot to be said about the ways, with psychedelics, the ways that we work with plants in a non-psychedelic place. There's still exploitation, and there's we're seeing right now the super bloom and all of these people flocking to these beautiful blooms but laying on them and ripping them up and taking them, and there is still the theft of colonialism is alive and well when we just expect that these plants, because they're just out in the world, are ours for the taking. So it's again building relationships and looking to indigenous elders. I mean, all communities have long and ongoing relationships to plants. So it's also looking into your own history and your own ancestors and your own lineage to see how your people worked with plants historically and how you can bring that. Because that's the medicine, is bringing that work from an ancestral past into the present with you. So yeah, diving into your own background too.
That feels like a huge part of our collective trauma is that very disconnect.
Yeah.
Linking that back up feels so essential.
Yeah.
Thank you. This is amazing. You're just such a wealth of information. And thank you for the work that you do. You're helping a lot of people, and that's a really important and beautiful way to be in the world. So
thank you. Thanks for bringing so many voices up and out too, and really giving a platform for people to be in their work and be sharing it with people.
It's my pleasure.
Thank you.
Yay.
Yo no
Thank you for spending time hanging out with us again today. You can find more of Jennifer in all her magical forms at corpusritual.com. And next week, we're going to kind of pick up where we left off. Catherine Soley is coming to do a deep dive episode on poison plants. So we'll just keep flowing with the medicine. You guys are the fucking best. I'm in Georgia now. I live in Georgia now for a while. And I got a lot more coming your way. Thanks for being with me. It means the world.